Afternoon again. I'm welcoming everybody on behalf of the UNESCO Cluster Bureau in Almaty on our second webinar, online webinar, on the development or on capacity building of the local managers managing the property of World Heritage. And this webinar was put together jointly with ICCROM, ICOMOS. And last week, on the 1st of July, we had the first webinar, during which we, with the representatives of the World Heritage Center, were discussing various responsibilities of the parties in the framework of the Convention on the World Heritage. And the recording of this webinar is already available on our YouTube channel. I'm going to send the link to the chat. You can take a look at it. It is available both in Russian and in English. And our today's topic is dedicated to the planning of the territory around the World Heritage sites, proactive planning, and the evaluation or assessment on the impact on the World Heritage properties. And I would like to remind you that the next seminar will take place on the 8th of July, this Thursday. All information about the speakers, as well as the information on the webinars that are planned in July, will be available if you follow the following link that I have already sent to the chat. 3 webinars that we are already planning for the beginning of July. These are not our last webinars, because we are now discussing some other topics with our international experts to keep an eye on the news and on the information that will be published in our sources on this webinar and on other webinars that will be conducted by Almaty UNESCO Cluster Bureau. And you can subscribe to us. The link is available in the chat. And now I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers today, and when they will be speaking, if necessary, they will probably introduce themselves at greater lengths. In the alphabetical order, in English, Sarah Court is representing ICCROM. She is the coordinator on the impact assessment on the World Heritage objects. Mr. Boris Erk, who is the director of the regional IUCN Bureau in Eastern and Europe and Central Asia. There is a representative of ICOMOS, Mr. Richard Mackay, and who is also the advisor of ICOMOS on the World Heritage issues, and Ms. Mizuki Murai, who is the specialist on the environmental protection, and she is in charge of the protection of the natural heritage as well as the mixed heritage. And now we are going to listen to our speakers. Now you will be able to react, and please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat if you want to send your questions. And I would like also to remind you that the presentations that you are going to listen to now are in English, but we have already got them translated into Russian. Therefore, if it will be more convenient for you to read through the Russian version of the presentations, you can open up on your screen, and you can page them in parallel with the speakers. Now you will find the link to Google Drive, from which you will be able to download the presentations in Russian. And I would like to draw your attention that all these presentations and the documents in PDF will be provided exclusively for your personal use, for you to familiarize yourself with these presentations and to disseminate them inside your organizations. But of course, you cannot quote, you cannot use the information from these presentations, because this can only be done upon a written consent. Now, I would like to turn the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Boris Erk, who is representing IUCN. Please, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, all participants. I would like to congratulate all of you, and now I will switch to English.
presentations are also available in Russian. I unfortunately do not feel comfortable enough to speak in Russian, but I can follow some discussion for sure. The first, of course, I would like to welcome all the participants. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today after the first workshop last week. So we are moving into World Heritage realm by shedding more light on World Heritage process in terms of identifying sites and nominations and impact assessments, so that we are detailing a bit more how to enhance World Heritage in Central Asia. My colleague Mizuki is with me today. We represent one of the advisory bodies today in the training. And I myself will just introduce a little bit IUCN's work on World Heritage, in particular in Central Asia. So I'll share my screen now and give the presentation. And I'm just making it full screen. And you just please let me know if everything is okay. Mr. Masanov, is it visible?
Yes, it's okay. We can see your presentation.
Okay, okay, so just the few slides then on IUCN's most recent work on World Heritage in Central Asia. And here I have to say that I was very pleased. I took part last week in the first meeting, inaugural meeting of the regional committee for Western Tian Shan World Heritage Property. I'm very pleased for that development, and I'm very happy that both UNESCO, a cluster office in Almaty, and an IUCN took part in that meeting. So we see that as an important really step forward in the management of this transnational serial site. So one of the most important sites, certainly, when it comes to natural World Heritage in Central Asia. Okay, so just a few words about how IUCN actually works in Central Asia, in other regions as well. You know that IUCN is a membership union. So IUCN consists of the Secretariat, member organizations, and commissions, which are experts. So it's sort of a threefold approach to any particular place or region, yeah, in terms of World Heritage. In Central Asia in particular, we work through our World Heritage program, headquartered in Gland, through Regional Office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which I represent, based in Belgrade, and of course through a number of expert commissions, so a number of experts who are associated with IUCN commissions like protected areas, species conservation, environmental law, and so on. They also contribute in their capacity to World Heritage. So when we say IUCN, then we actually think of the World Heritage Program, Regional Office, and experts, let alone a number of partner organizations who are involved in World Heritage processes. So for you to know that there is more than one addressee that you can reach out to when it comes to World Heritage. We have slightly different roles in this process, and I'll explain that in a bit. So what we primarily do and how we support the state parties, research organizations, site managers, civil society organizations, individuals, is through capacity development, a knowledge development or knowledge generation, a monitoring and evaluation of World Heritage sites, a nomination processes, and the very management of inscribed World Heritage sites. Most recently, IUCN Regional Office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, together with the World Heritage Program, embarked on a project to develop a thematic study for Central Asia, World Heritage thematic study. Quite a few participants in today's trainings have taken part in that project as well. And the project included developing a thematic study, but also helping build capacity on various aspects of World Heritage process, like nomination, capacity for management, and so on. We also helped translate the study on the volume on World Heritage management into Russian, and that study is now available on the UNESCO website. Yeah, so there was one important kind of early step in supporting World Heritage nomination in Central Asia through developing a thematic study. The thematic study focused on criteria 9 and 10 only. As we, in the process of project development, we identified those 2 criteria as very important for moving along and supporting partners in Central Asia on those. Yeah, and the study resulted, and the study is available, of course. The study resulted in a number of sites, either inscribed or new sites with potential for World Heritage. Yeah, there was a total of 9 sites, of which some are already inscribed, like the Golden Mountains of Altai, and then a Saryarka steppe and wetland in northern Kazakhstan, western Tian Shan. But there are also new sites that show potential for inscription on the World Heritage list. Of course, that this is just a study. So this is sort of a suggestion to state parties and partners in Central Asia on where to focus on, which sites to focus on in terms of either extension or new nominations. We prepared, of course, a series of maps and identifying those potential future World Heritage sites. Yeah, what matters here is that quite a few of sites are transnational, transboundary, transnational in nature. And that's also one of the key recommendations that these thematic study have provided, is that strengthening partnerships at regional level, a transboundary level, is a way forward for Central Asia. Of course, there were a few other recommendations, like updating the tentative lists, looking into priority sites in light of other global conventions and processes, improve dialogue among stakeholder, really partnership building, building a stakeholder networks, and building capacity, one of the things that we are doing today. Another way of working on World Heritage is through monitoring and evaluation. And you know that IUCN have launched a World Heritage Outlook a few years back. Last year we had the third edition of World Heritage Outlook, and that process is really to consult with a wide array of partners in understanding how World Heritage sites are being managed. And you can see, for example, I've just extracted the latest World Heritage Outlook on the 3 sites in Central Asia. Yeah, so we can see that some are, according to World Heritage Outlook, some are with less and some are with a bit more concern. Yeah, and then finally, some recent steps towards supporting World Heritage in Central Asia with IUCN is through the Green List of Protected and Conserved Areas. Is the highest standard in good governance of protected and conserved areas, which has relevance for World Heritage as well, supporting transboundary cooperation. I just mentioned our participation in the regional committee for the Western Xinjiang World Heritage Site. We are in discussion with the UNESCO a cluster office on supporting the Tajik National Park in Tajikistan. And as some of you know, that IUCN was coordinator of the Global Partnership for HA11 Biodiversity Target, where we supported first and foremost Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan updating their data sets of protected areas in the global database, which has led to almost like reaching the biodiversity target 11. Yeah. And so in conclusion, as already mentioned, there is a lot of potential. We know that. I mean, the thematic study have confirmed that as well. We didn't fully tap into. We were looking into natural World Heritage, but I have no doubt that same pertains to cultural properties as well. So there is exceptional value with properties in Central Asia that have not yet been fully recognized, identified, and further moved into World Heritage process. that there is a need for updating national tentative lists. Better if it is a coordinated approach where you are then at once looking into your tentative lists and review them in consultation with experts. There is a need for capacity development just as everywhere, and we are very happy to be able to support it on that, especially when it comes to World Heritage nomination and management. Transboundary cooperation is something that's extremely relevant for Central Asia, and that's something that we are really looking forward to supporting. IUCN has a lot of expertise for transboundary and transnational cooperation. And one note on the part of the advisory body, as we are doing today, we should make a concerted effort in supporting you to enhancing World Heritage in Central Asia. I'll stop here, and I'll thank you all for your attention. And of course, happy to answer any question. Thanks a lot. Так, спасибо большое.
Господин Эрк, большое спасибо.
Mr. Erk, thanks a lot. And since I have already started receiving questions, therefore, probably I think it will be feasible first for all our speakers to make their presentations, and then at the end we will have a Q&A session. And this is the reason for which I would like now to invite the second presenter, Mr. Richard Mackay, who is representing ICOMOS. Please, the floor is yours.
I have the pleasure of speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. The presentation that I'm giving this evening is about management planning for World Heritage properties, and looking particularly at the principles and the processes that attach to management planning. And I'd like to begin by reminding participants that the obligations for management planning at World Heritage properties arise from the World Heritage Convention. And particularly they arise under Article 4 of the Convention through obligations to protect, conserve, and present values, to integrate the protection into comprehensive planning, to give World Heritage a life in the community, to strengthen appreciation through education and information, to keep the community informed about the condition and values of the property, and to adopt scientific, technical, legal, financial, and administrative measures. And management planning fits particularly into that last dot point about appropriate administrative measures. I'd also like to highlight that outstanding universal value is what underpins the World Heritage system. And inscribed properties are inscribed together with a statement of outstanding universal value. For some of the earlier inscriptions, that may be retrospective, and it is critical. And the statement of outstanding universal value is more than just the criteria. A lot of people in the World Heritage system focus on the criteria under which a property was inscribed. But in fact, outstanding universal value has three key elements, as illustrated on the right of the screen. Firstly, there is the criteria that property meet one or more of those criteria. Then secondly, there are the conditions of integrity and authenticity. And the third pillar relates to protection and management. And the management of World Heritage properties has as a primary objective to retain, conserve, and transmit that outstanding universal value. Now, this can be done in many ways, and one of the major themes of my presentation today is that there is no one recipe for preparing a management plan or for undertaking management of World Heritage properties. That will depend very much on the nature and circumstance of the property, the nature of its values, the nature of the issues that must be addressed. And all three of the advisory bodies have published online and elsewhere multiple guides that provide assistance to the managers and regulators of World Heritage properties in relation of a management principle and process that is used in a document which originated in Australia, but it's used widely in the Asia Pacific. It's known as the Burra Charter, and it has 4 key stages in managing a cultural heritage property. Firstly, one assesses the values and understands why the place is important. Secondly, identify the issues. Thirdly, develop policy. And then fourthly, manage. And this inherent logic of understanding values, identifying issues, developing a policy approach, and then managing the place to conserve the values and manage the issues underpins a lot of good management planning for World Heritage properties. And another Asian example I thought it useful to share with you comes from Cambodia, and I will later in this presentation virtually visit the World Heritage property at Angkor. And this is one of the processes used in preparing the heritage management plan for Angkor. 10 steps here you can see have been culturally presented in the Khmer language, the local language, and the logic is very similar. Step 1 is to define the area. Step 2, to define the vision for management. Step 3, the stakeholder analysis. 4 is reviewing existing information. 5 is that important phase of identifying heritage values. 6, identifying issues. 7, and analysing the issues. 8 is preparing the objectives and strategies, the policy framework. 9, the action plans. And then 10 is all about the implementation, the responsibilities, the monitoring, the evaluation, and the review. So, in terms of World Heritage Management properties, why do we have them? What are they and how? In the rest of this presentation, I will be firstly looking at the 7 stages in the top of this screen. Why do we need a management plan for World Heritage property? What should a management plan do? What does a management plan contain? Who should be involved? What is the process for preparing a plan? What time is needed and how to implement that plan? And then very quickly at the end of the presentation, I will look at some examples, particularly for Angkor in Cambodia, and then 3 from Australia, Uluru Karachuta, which is a mixed sacred site, Jenolan Caves, which is a natural area, and finally, just for fun, Luna Park, which is a historic amusement park. So the first question, well, why do we need management plans for World Heritage properties? Leaving aside the obligations that arise under the World Heritage Convention and its operational guidelines, management planning is important to know where we're going, to guide the decision-making. It's important to enable the protection of the outstanding universal value of the property and to ensure that all the activities are compatible with its heritage significance. It's important to solve issues and prevent conflicts, to coordinate and unite stakeholders. And as many of those who are present who are site managers will know, it's also very helpful to prioritise resource allocation. Then what should the management plan do? Well, the management plan fulfills 2 key functions. It's both a tool to assist managers and a resource to inform managers and other stakeholders in the process. So it provides valuable information and it also provides guidance. And it's important that management plans strike that balance between providing useful information and providing clear guidance. And that might be a guidance to those who are responsible for the site or for those who might be involved in something that could affect the site. So it's relevant to heritage managers or government regulators, to those who inhabit the site or those who use the site, to visitors and to potential developers. And developers may be, of course, adjacent to the site and their activities may affect the World Heritage property. A management plan is the basis for successful management, and it needs to set out realistic actions which suit the cultural, social, natural and political environment. So what should a management plan contain? And here there are really 4 key elements, and you will see that these are very similar to some of the principles and steps in the process. Firstly, a management plan needs to contain an introduction. It needs to contain enough information to understand the site, descriptions and maps, information on its history or its state of conservation, its management needs. A management plan will then need to have a clear understanding of the significance of the property. In the case of World Heritage properties, that is the outstanding universal value, and the attributes of the property that contribute and support outstanding universal value. A management plan should then include an analysis of the current situation, that is the key issues, the threats, and the opportunities. So you can see there we have understanding the heritage values, understanding the issues, and then the operational end of the plan needs to include objectives, guiding principles and policies, that is the general approach to managing the site, and then most importantly at the end, some kind of action plan with responsibilities. So it is clear what things will be done and who will do them. My next question is who should be involved? And the point here, particularly for something like a World Heritage property, is that it is an inclusive process. It should involve people with an interest in the site, and they will include the decision makers and the regulators, but also the managers and others who are actually responsible for work on the ground, and be informed by specialist advisors and facilitators. And it's very important that this be an inclusive process so that stakeholders are able to contribute and are able to become involved. So who should be involved? Well, there's an interesting quote here that a management plan is not signed by a single author. It reflects the collective effort of various people related to the site, and they are the stakeholders. And there's a list on the screen of whom the stakeholders might include. There might be designated heritage managers, such as some of yourselves. There may be relevant state or local authorities, community members, potential developers, scientists such as archaeologists, historians or anthropologists, site users, visitors, tourists, tour operators, teachers and religious groups. The list should be inclusive rather than exclusive and will be customised to reflect the particular circumstance of the World Heritage property. An important thing to understand is that the process for management planning at a World Heritage property is very seldom as linear as that steps in the process that I showed earlier. It's important that we do what is in the middle of this screen, that is to assess the values, identify the issues, develop the policies and manage the place. But it's very unusual for it to happen in the nice orderly steps that are shown on the left. What is much more frequent is that there is an iterative and interactive process involving jumping back and forth, where values will become apparent because people are responding to issues. That decisions about managing will be informed by resource allocation and priorities, which can in turn lead to identification of new policy needs. So it's important to understand that in preparing a management plan, the process and the steps do not happen in an orderly fashion. They rely on each other and the process needs to be repetitive, and different steps will inform and require loop back to other steps as the management plan is prepared. Now, a question that I'm often asked is, well, how long does it take to prepare a management plan? And for a World Heritage property, in my experience, depending on the nature and complexity of the property, a management plan will typically take from 6 months to several years. And 6 months, even for a very simple World Heritage property, such as a single building, is reasonable because of the time that it inevitably takes to consult with stakeholders, consult with government agents, review a draft, and undertake all of the steps that are needed to ensure that values are conserved and issues are addressed. It's quite often the case that there will be conflicts or different points of view that need to be resolved between the stakeholders, and this can take time. It's also important to commit to regular review of the management plan, and that should happen every 5 years or if major circumstances change. And the final point on this screen is an important one, that a management plan is never perfect. Even if it's not perfect, it's better to adopt and use it and amend it progressively. There are far too many properties inscribed on the World Heritage List where draft plans have been in preparation for of the order of a decade, which is far too long. It's better to finalise a plan, have it submitted to the World Heritage Centre, have it adopted and implemented, and then progressively change and improve it over time. Implementation is a very important step. It's not sufficient simply to prepare the document and have it sit on a shelf. It needs to be adopted and endorsed, and for a World Heritage property, that is not only by the relevant national authority, but also by the World Heritage Committee. The adopted plan, of course, then needs to be disseminated to decision makers, managers and stakeholders, and then the actions and implementation needs to be scheduled with allocated budgets and resources. And then, of course, there's reporting on progress and regular updates, and that can happen at a domestic level, and of course also happens at the international level through periodic reporting under the World Heritage Convention and through the World Heritage State of Conservation processes. It's very important to monitor the site and the progress, and ultimately to use the results of that monitoring to evaluate and revise the plan. Monitoring and evaluation is therefore an extraordinarily important step, and there is a wonderful tool for measuring and evaluating the effectiveness, management effectiveness for World Heritage properties. It's published by IUCN and it's known as Enhancing Our Heritage. It was prepared, I think, with natural World Heritage properties in mind, as it says there on the cover. But in fact, it is a methodology that works very well also for mixed and large-scale cultural heritage properties, particularly those that are representing landscapes or serial inscriptions. I'd like to use the remainder of the presentation. What I've just covered is the process and the content of management planning. I'd now like to show you some brief vignettes of 4 different management planning processes that illustrate different aspects of the points that I have made. And the first of those relates to Angkor, Cambodia. And this is an example of management planning in context at a landscape scale, an enormous scale. The Angkor World Heritage property is 400 square kilometres of cultural landscape with more than 700 monuments and more than 4 million visitors annually. And the Angkor is managed under a heritage management framework, which is based on identification of values, identification of issues, engaging with people, and an agreed set of management principles. So it provides a framework for the World Heritage Values conservation. It provides for improving governance by building capacity, an inclusive process for the local people, effective tourism management, integrated risk management, and testing and demonstration during the course of the preparation of the framework through some pilot projects. And fundamental to this framework for this enormous landscape with hundreds of monuments is recognising and conserving the values, and recognising that the conservation of Angkor requires protecting the values. Now, they may be World Heritage and outstanding universal value, but there are also other values such as natural values, hydraulics, intangible and spiritual association. And it's important in this context for a mass tourism site that both heritage management and tourism management agree about the set of values, because then it's possible to have sustainable management where there is agreement about the values that need to be conserved. The second major phase at Angkor, having agreed about the values, is identifying and responding to the issues. And at Angkor, they're very complicated. There are tourism and visitor impacts, as you can see in the illustration on screen. There is a very complex hydrology and local ecology. There are 100,000 people who live within the World Heritage property and they have needs. There are human resource needs for the site managers. There are multiple agencies that need to be coordinated, and there are a wide range of environmental, social, and economic risks. And what is remarkable about this planning framework in this very difficult context is that it has been a people-centred participatory planning process, which has included input from the local communities, the 100,000 people who live in the site, and the tourism operators to inform the values identification, the issues identification, and the management planning. And it's led to a series of principles for management, which are very briefly summarised on screen, noting that Angkor has outstanding universal value, that the responsibility for conservation is shared between the government agencies, UNESCO and other stakeholders, that land use and tourism needs to be sustainable and controlled so that the values can be conserved, and that the social and cultural diversity of the communities contribute to the outstanding universal value, and that we need ongoing collaboration. So there's this overarching agreement about the management principles which address the issues and conserve the values. And then the policies, and there are 10 major policies for Angkor with a whole lot of sub-policies, are presented in a hierarchy with the headings, and then for each set of policies, the one on screen is the environmental conservation. So for each of these, there is a series of sub-policies and there's specific information about how the place will be managed with respect to each of the identified policy subjects. This all comes together in an overall framework, and the framework, firstly, in the image on the right, presents the rationale and methodology, presents in the blue box a vision and principles, in the mauve box the natural and cultural heritage values, then the statutory operational context, the state of conservation, a strategic approach, conservation and management policies, implementation policies and recommendations. I'm not going to deal with everything that's on this screen, except to say that some of the other boxes here, such as the tourism management plan or the risk mapping, are integral aspects of the management for the site. But I would like to take the implementation part of this plan and just highlight how it is presented. For each of the implementation actions, there is a program. There are 4: heritage conservation, life in the community, sustainable tourism, and governance and capacity. And each of them is matched with one of the 10 major policies. And then for each of these programs, there are a series of priority projects. Each project is represented in a box. So for example, there was a project to prepare a charter of Angkor, or under life in the community, there was a series of community-based programs, or under sustainable tourism, there was a tourism management plan. And the point of this is that the policies are carried through into specific implementation actions which have a time frame, which have a budget allocation, and which have someone who is responsible for doing them. And it has been an extraordinarily successful project. The second of my 4 examples is a natural area. It's the Jenolan Caves, which are part of the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area in Australia. And this is an underground set. It's the oldest open cave system in the world, and it has an extraordinary array of very beautiful formations, and again, some very major issues arising from tourism and visitation. And one of the issues, and I just want to highlight one issue and its management response, is how to manage visitor congestion. And the question here is how to prevent the damage to the caves, to address environmental impacts, to ensure the quality of the visitor experience, and to make sure that there is visitor comfort and safety. And this is done through a social and environmental management program where there is constant monitoring of the environmental data, that's scientific information about air quality or acidity or moisture content or growth of fauna, and also monitoring social data about the visitor experience, whether people were happy, whether they had a good time, whether there was too much crowding, whether they felt comfortable or uncomfortable. And this data is linked back to the management plan and is measured on a continuing basis. So on the screen in front of you, you can see a guide here with a little device that measures radon, which is one of the dangerous gases in the cave system. There's measuring of lint coming off people's clothes and skin, measuring of the water quality, you can see in the right-hand image on the stalactites, and measuring track erosion with the device that's in the bottom left of the screen. And all of this information is gathered and correlated to to indicators such as weather or visitor satisfaction. And so, without going into lots of detail, there are some charts which establish the links between the monitoring and the management decisions. So it's possible, for example, to correlate the erosion on the surface tracks with weather events and visitation events, and then to make management responses that deal with the scientific data that have been gathered. And so the importance of this system is that there is a direct link between the daily management and monitoring of the site and the management planning framework. The example that I have on screen on the left is what is ultimately a large airlock door. And what the monitoring of this particular cave shows is that when there are large numbers of visitation in quick succession, the air quality diminishes and the carbon dioxide level increases. What it also shows is that when there is a high level of carbon dioxide, what is necessary is to keep the door closed and to close the cave for visitation for a number of days to enable the natural environment to recover. So the condition of the resource, its state of conservation, is directly linked to an indicator being carbon dioxide, which is linked to monitoring of environmental data and management decisions about when the door will be closed. My third example, also from Australia, is Uluru Katachuta, which is a mixed site exhibiting both natural and cultural values. And I should say that and I acknowledge that I am presenting a site which is important to the Anangu people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I note that when Anangu people look at this rock, they see the embodied spirit of their ancestors. When many other people look at the rock, they see the world's largest monolith. By any measure, it's an extraordinarily important site, but it is a site which has traditional owners, Aboriginal people who have cared for this country for thousands of generations. So when Europeans look at the rock, they see it on the left through the eyes of a tourist. When traditional owners look at the rock, they see it on the right. They see it as embodying stories. The image on the right is the rock in the middle, and the snake on the top left and bottom left-hand corner of that image are part of the cultural stories, as are the animal tracks that you can see also in this image. So Aboriginal people look at this rock and they see stories, and they have an understanding that other people do not have about the importance of the place and its values. And the simple point that I want to make is that in preparing the management plan for this place, it was not prepared in an office. It was prepared out on the land. It was not just prepared by experts. It was prepared in collaboration with the traditional owners to whom this place is important. And when the plan was finally presented, it was presented not just as a written document, but also as an artwork. And it's therefore presented in a format that makes it accessible for people like the Aboriginal rangers on the left to share the stories and share the requirements with the traditional owners and stakeholders to whom this place is important. So what is on the right is actually the plan of management as presented to the traditional owners of this cultural and natural property. And you can see on screen in one of the images the process for preparing the plan. You can see as well in the bottom left the process for managing the traffic, or in the bottom right some of the tourism activities. In the bottom middle you can see some of the traditional owner activities. And my final short example relates to an amusement park on the shores of Sydney Harbour. And the most important point I want to make with this case study is that management planning needs to be customized. The steps that you go through, the values that you identify, the issues that are addressed, and the management approach and actions will all depend on the nature and circumstances of the property, and everyone will be different. This amusement park was constructed on the site that was used for the workshops to build Sydney's Harbour Bridge, and it's right in central Sydney on the side of the harbour. It features extraordinary Art Deco and Moorish architecture, and it's got high social significance, and it has unusually been conserved through reconstruction, adaptation, and ongoing use. This is a photograph of the site when it was built. If you go there today, it looks very similar, but none of the fabric that you see is from the time when the amusement park was built, which is a very unusual approach for a cultural heritage property. The process itself was unusual, although following that general logic that I talked about. So here we have summarised on screen the process for preparing this management plan, which included in the second column from the left, the tasks column, understanding the place, assessing the values, analysing the issues, and preparing the policies. But it also needed to reflect some of the special issues that attach to this site. Things like the fact that it's the collective childhood for Sydney, or that there are unhappy local residents, that there is a centenary coming up, and that there will be a party when the site turns 100. So a customised process. The management plan itself contains all the things that you would expect: an introduction, historical analysis, analysis of the place, of its fabric, of its archaeology, its heritage values, the statutory context, in other words, the laws, the opportunities and constraints or the issues, conservation management policies, and implementation. And there is a broad range of policy content. And you can see here that there are matters in this policy that would not apply to many sites. Things, for example, like rides and amusements, or movable heritage, or the need to do training and induction for the staff who are there greeting visitors at the site. One of the devices that's used to manage this place is colour coding of the different elements. And so the elements that are most important on the site are colour-coded red. The next most important are colour-coded orange, then yellow, then grey, and then things which are intrusive and need to be removed are colour-coded blue. This is a really helpful management device because it gives a guide to the site managers about where it's appropriate to have intervention and where intervention should be avoided. There is an analysis of views, so it's understood where there are important sight lines between elements of the site or from the site out or outside the site looking in. And this is very important because it guides those who would undertake development about where it is inappropriate to have new development because of the effect on significant views. There is an archaeological zoning plan. So the plan on the right of the screen shows where on this site it is likely that there are significant archaeological features. And again, there is clarity in the requirements in a flowchart on the left about when and where you don't have to get an archaeologist involved if the site is to be disturbed or excavated. There is a policy about the colours and the aesthetic contributions. So there's a policy that talks about when the different colours will be used on the site, bearing in mind that they're an important part of its history. And there is a simple asset management sheet. So for each of the individual elements, that each building and each ride, there is a very simple summary of the policy position. And you can see at the bottom of the screen on the left, a list of things that you do and a list of things that you don't do, which connect the management policies to the people on the ground who are making day-to-day decisions and doing things to care for this historic site. So colleagues, that is a very quick run through the concept of management planning for World Heritage properties, and I too would be happy to address any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. We will have this third presentation now, the representative of the third advisory body on the World Heritage Convention. And Ms. Sarah, please, you're representing ICCROM. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. And very nice to be speaking to you today. After Richard's presentation on management, we're going to look at a slightly different theme now in impact assessment, but it's very much related to management. I hope by the end of our presentations, you'll see how the two share a very common foundation. The thinking to World Heritage is the same. Perhaps the difference between what we're going to talk about is management planning, as Richard has described, is taking a very proactive approach to daily care and management of a place. But we all know that sometimes issues arise that weren't expected, or a new proposal comes, and impact assessment is the tool that we're using to decide how that might affect World Heritage. So I will share my screen and I will provide you with this first presentation on impact assessment, and then Mizuki and Richard will take let's say the points I'm offering here are more theoretical and the principles of impact assessment, and they will follow up with some very concrete case studies so that what we say should hang together well. Now, I wanted to start by simply mentioning that you will start to hear a lot about impact assessment this year, because this new document is going to the World Heritage Committee later this month, and hopefully shortly after that it will be available as a free publication from the World Heritage website. So what we're offering you today is a little preview of the work that has been going on amongst the advisory bodies for the last 2 years. And you'll be able to see more about this when it comes out. So let's start with a definition of impact assessment, because for many people in heritage, it's a new area. This is from the International Association for Impact Assessment, and they would define it as a process of identifying future consequences of a proposed action. And I'm going to make it even more simple. It's thinking before you act. What we want to suggest in this presentation and the next one is that very often things are happening at World Heritage properties, and if we spent a short time thinking and discussing amongst ourselves, we could avoid an awful lot of the issues that are coming in front of the committee. So impact assessment is a great way of making your life easier, I'd like to suggest. Now, carrying out an impact assessment has two big benefits. One is that if we take this time to use a solid methodology to think in advance, it's a tool that can really help planning. We can improve proposals that are being put forward for our World Heritage properties. And it can also simply help better decision making. Is this a proposal that is compatible with World Heritage, yes or no? So we've got ways of really helping you as managers, if you find yourself in difficult situations, which is happening increasingly, for you to be able to get out of the difficult situations and really find planning processes much easier. So why has this got anything to do with World Heritage? Well, if we look back to when World Heritage was first thought about, as the convention was drawn up, it was in the case of the Aswan Dam, and there was a huge concern about the construction of a dam and how that would affect the heritage. So these are situations which continue today. The concern at the very beginning of World Heritage was about these changing development projects that were impacting World Heritage, and we needed to consider the heritage in advance. And it's very much at the heart of what the convention states. When a state party decides to join up to the convention, there is a commitment to protect and conserve World Heritage, And we all know that in the 21st century, that is heritage which is in a context of increased pressure, and we're making increased demands on that heritage. And the research about World Heritage shows, this is from the State of Conservation reporting, that our World Heritage properties around the world are facing a lot of difficulties. So for those of you who are working at a property with big problems, you are not alone. This is a global concern. I find these figures slightly depressing, but I think if we recognise that these are problems we're facing in every continent, and that there are now global efforts to try to address them, you'll perhaps find that some of the tools we're offering are very useful. And so impact assessment has become one of the most useful tools for addressing some of these big concerns. This is simply a representation of the number of impact assessments that the World Heritage Committee is requesting. And now, obviously, most countries have their own system of environmental impact assessments. So you can imagine the situation globally, impact assessments are happening on an even greater scale if these are just the ones for World Heritage. And of course, I wanted to add another major issue of World Heritage that we are dealing with these days is sustainable development. Thanks to the policy in 2015, when we're managing World Heritage, there's also the obligation to contribute to sustainable development, which in some ways can be seen to complicate our lives. But I think we need to understand sustainable development in these terms. I found this a very helpful graphic of the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's trying to illustrate that when development takes place, it is only sustainable if any of the economic goals are seen within the context of society and the context of our environmental heritage. You cannot achieve one goal without considering all of the goals. We want to stress that there's no, when we talk about sustainable development in this context, it should be very clear that we're not saying that we support development and so maybe some problems for World Heritage are acceptable. No, what we're wanting is to have a thriving world where World Heritage is protected, as well as being able to achieve these goals for our society at large. But if we are hoping that World Heritage contributes to these big agendas, what's that got to do with impact assessment? So I return to the definition I gave you at the beginning, and it actually continues. And this is, I think, is very interesting. It has been recognised that it's also a tool that can help meet today's needs without compromising the opportunities of future generations. Now, some of you may recognise that this is actually a quote that comes from the Brundtland Report, which was perhaps the first document that tried to describe sustainable development. So if we are doing impact assessment well, what we would like to suggest today is that we can allow our societies to move forward for the benefit of our communities while protecting World Heritage and also achieving some of these sustainable development goals. So it's a big task for a single tool, but I hope we'll convince you in this presentation and the next one. So it's worth you knowing that there are a family of assessments. You will often, in World Heritage context, hear about heritage impact assessments, which are very specifically focusing on the heritage. But we have many others which you might find very useful to know about. So we've got the two major ones here on the screen. Strategic environmental assessment, which looks at plans and policies and programs. So usually when a government or regional or local governments are putting forward plans or policies, we can assess them and ensure that it's working well for heritage. And most of your countries have environmental impact assessments. It's the most common impact assessment tool. It's something like 96% of the world now has these within their legislation. So they're a very useful tool for heritage professionals to work with. And they assess what we're calling here a proposed action. So if there is a project, and it may be something as a road project, an industrial project, a housing development, but even smaller things can be assessed at World Heritage. When it's a project, we are using the environmental and social impact assessment. Both of these exist outside of the heritage world, and it's really useful to know about them because as heritage site managers, if we can start to be part of the team that works on these assessments, we have a much greater chance of getting heritage included in our legal protections. However, there are cases when these national processes, they don't always recognise the impacts on heritage, or perhaps the proposal, the project is not big enough to require a national impact assessment. And in that case, World Heritage is asking for state parties to carry out their own impact assessments. And you can see here the two statements. When a new proposal is being considered for World Heritage, it's been long requested that the World Heritage Centre is notified in advance, because it can start a conversation with a state party and ensure that an assessment is carried out if necessary. And it's something that we're really putting emphasis on at the moment. If you see along the bottom of the slide, you have the steps of a project. From the minute that there is the idea, the concept, it's planned, and then it's constructed, and it starts to operate in the real world. If we start an assessment, we have, at the very early stages, we have an ability to influence that idea and make sure that the planning takes into consideration World Heritage. So we really need to be discussing these issues within the country, and then having a dialogue with the World Heritage Centre very early on, in order to make sure that an impact assessment takes place at the right time. And we don't get to a stage where already something is being constructed and causing damage before we even noticed heritage was involved. We're also asking that when impact assessments are carried out, there really needs to be a focus on what makes that World Heritage property special. So that's the outstanding universal value. As I mentioned, there have been environmental impact assessments carried out in countries for many years now. The reason the World Heritage Committee is now putting such emphasis on impact assessment is because those existing assessments were not really understanding World Heritage. So there's a real role for you as heritage people to be involved and ensure that those carrying out assessments understand the outstanding universal value, that there's a real sharing of what is important about our heritage properties. And essentially that comes down to using the statement of outstanding universal value that you will all have for your property, and really using that, analysing it in a way that we can communicate better. But these are details that we would go into if we were doing a week-long course on impact assessment, and you only have us today for 2 hours. So if some of these details we will leave for another time. It's also important that there is an independent team who can carry out an assessment, and we need to get very good at getting the right specialists involved. Very often a heritage-only team is not good enough. I give you 2 cases of impact assessments that were carried out for World Heritage where non-heritage people had to be involved to find a successful outcome. In the case of Villa Adriana in Italy, it was actually a lawyer with experience of public administration that managed to find a solution. In the case of Gaul, which is in Sri Lanka, it was a coastal engineer who had the technical expertise to advise. Having said that, when we find that there are impact assessments being carried out with no heritage people, that's obviously equally a problem. So we need to find a balance We need people with World Heritage knowledge, as well as people from relevant other sectors. And we need to be making sure that, as with all World Heritage processes, there is a focus on communities. When we find the stakeholders need to be engaged at different moments in the impact assessment, this is actually a very key moment for making sure that rights holders are involved appropriately and that there is transparency in the assessment process. Impact assessment is also an opportunity to ask some really basic questions, but ones which are often not considered. We find also often that a project is proposed and it seems a great idea to the people proposing it, but there's perhaps not been a logical series of checks on that proposal. So simple questions like, is this project necessary, or could we meet some objectives with a different solution? If we do decide it should be done, is there a different way of doing it? Should it go in a different location? And if the project we decide it should go forward, is there a different form in which it could take place? All of these are valid questions that will be illustrated in the following presentations by Mizuki and Richard. But we're finding that some really easy conversations can solve some very complex problems. And this helps us with really getting to the heart of the matter. An impact assessment wants to find out if there will be negative impacts in order to avoid them. It's a very simple concept. In some cases, it might be that those negative impacts will just be minimized to a point where they're no longer of concern. But we also want to be able to enhance positive impact. If there is a project proposed and it is needed for the World Heritage property or near to it, we really must be demanding best practice. And that means ensuring that any positive benefits that we can gain, these should be demanded to ensure that all projects are really at the highest quality possible. In some cases, that desire to check if the project is necessary and the absolute need to ensure that World Heritage is not impacted in a negative way, that will lead to the option of not proceeding with the project. I give the example here of the State Party of Italy, which responded to an impact assessment which showed that negative impacts would occur, and the Minister of Culture decided that that was enough to stop the project. They were not prepared to risk World Heritage, and this is the kind of ultimate decision. We would hope that in most cases, impact assessment can help perhaps edit a project in a way that the negative impacts are removed. But if that's not possible, ultimately the responsibility to World Heritage will need to lead to these kind of significant decisions. Impact assessments as well, often we find that they focus on a single project. There might be a new road project, or there might be a new energy project. But we need to remember that our World Heritage is not in isolation. It might be that one energy project is in fact just the first of many, and that one energy project might not cause huge amounts of negative impact, but together, collectively, a number of projects definitely will have significant negative impacts. Or we might find that there are a series of different types of projects, all of which happening in the general location of World Heritage really will cause a problem. So we need to not be too simplistic in our approaches. You're all working at World Heritage properties. You're aware of the complexity of the situation you're working in. We need to be able to take that sophisticated understanding of the places we work in and apply it to the logic of these assessments. example, there are impact assessments sometimes occurring for port development projects. And in theory, a port development project could focus simply on the physical infrastructure needed for ships to dock in a port. But I give this as an example that if it's a cruise ship that is being planned to come to that port, it is not just the physical infrastructure that might be a problem, it might be then the use patterns. So this is the example of Venice, where there's been a lot of controversy about cruise ships because the people getting off the ships are such an enormous number that the city has been drowning in tourists. So in this case, it's not just the physical infrastructure that needs to be assessed, it's also all of the following use and exactly what will happen. We need to describe a future situation that would occur. So we must remember all of the complexity that comes with a new development. Now, in this diagram, you don't need to understand all of the rather confusing English, as it's meant to be the process of an impact assessment. We really would encourage anyone who's interested in the subject to come on one of the courses that the advisory bodies organise, and you would be able to understand the full process that is on this slide. But just to understand that it's very easy to be able to say that you need to do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the correct order, and that's a very easy way of writing a final report and solving your problem. We want to remind people that actually a lot of these steps, a lot of the discussions need to keep happening in dialogue. So without going into the details of these individual steps, once we've understood what is special about World Heritage, once we've started discussing what might happen if a project takes place, it's really helpful to also be looking at problem solving, going back and making suggestions about how to improve a project. And then it would be necessary to go back again and rethink about the impact. So although very often you will see methodologies that look very clear and easy, we'd like to remind you all that these are discussions that need to take place over time, thought processes and analyses that need to continue so that we're really sure that we've understood every element of the project and we can be genuinely finding solutions that will work. I give an example to illustrate this. This is again the example I mentioned before from Gaul in Sri Lanka, where there was a proposed port development. In this case, the impact assessment concluded that the project could probably go ahead, but we needed to make some technical changes, and the suggestion was made. In this case, it will be necessary once the project is revised to return to that and do a new impact assessment. So we can always make sure that there's an ongoing discussion and really guaranteeing that World Heritage is protected. And all of this thought process should be embedded in the management system of the World Heritage property. Again, we don't have time to discuss how all of this happens, but the logic that we apply to our management planning, as you saw with Richard, should also be applying with assessment processes, and they should be mutually beneficial in terms of our understanding of the World Heritage property. And with that, I think you've had enough theory, and I'd love to hand you over to my colleagues so that they can give you a few examples from real life, and it will probably make much better sense. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand over.
Thank you very much. This is our third out of 5 presentations. We have 2 PowerPoints to go, and we only have 45 minutes to go. I'd like to ask 2 of our remaining speakers, please be slightly more concise, slightly shorter in your presentations, because we would like to take some questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce our fourth speaker, Ms. Mackay. So, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen. I trust that you will be able to see this screen. So my name is Mizuki Murai. I work in the IUCN's World Heritage Programme. I'm the focal point in the team for impact assessments, and today would like to present to you the steps and processes of impact assessment within the World Heritage context. So at the top, I'll show this figure again, which Sarah showed in her presentation, illustrating the processes for assessing the potential impacts of a proposed action. I'll go through the steps from screening through to reporting before I hand over to my colleague, Richard. As Sarah mentioned, it's not a linear process. And ideally, you'll go back and repeat some processes. But for simplicity of this presentation, I'll show it as a linear one. And before I dive into the steps, I want to show this diagram at the bottom, the triangle, which illustrates the unique and special places that are World Heritage, and which combined still only cover a very small proportion of the planet. If we consider the whole pyramid to be represented in protected areas globally, only the selected handful meet the threshold for holding outstanding universal value. And by their very nature and definition, these are irreplaceable. So these special places deserve extra protection. For activities outside the boundaries of a World Heritage Site, certain developments, such as dams, can have a major impact, even at hundreds of kilometers away. So this also needs to be taken into account when undertaking impact assessments. So the first step is consultation. And because this needs to happen throughout the impact assessment process, I'll start with the next step, which is to decide whether an impact assessment is necessary, a step known as screening. Screening criteria are used to determine the exact nature of the impact assessment, and in some cases, this might be its location. Proposed actions that may affect a World Heritage Site should always trigger an impact assessment and determine the degree of impact on OUV. Activities that are proposed inside the World Heritage boundaries or its officially recognized buffer zone, especially if it's a large scale, should immediately trigger alarm bells. In cases where such activities may lead to irreversible or permanent alterations to the OUV, the impact assessment process should be halted there and not proceed any further. There are certain activities that are strictly off limits inside a World Heritage Site. This includes mineral, oil and gas exploration and exploitation inside natural World Heritage Sites, as well as dams with large reservoirs. So if a proposed project is either of these, the project as described shouldn't proceed further beyond this point and should be stopped. The International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, has made a commitment to respect the importance of World Heritage Sites and therefore abstain from mining or exploring in World Heritage Sites. Some individual companies have also committed not to undertake any activities inside World Heritage boundaries and make sure any activities that are outside World Heritage Sites won't affect the OUV. Similar commitments have also been made by financial companies to not invest in projects affecting World Heritage Sites. Scoping is the process of determining the content and extent of the matters which should be covered in the EIA, sometimes also called the feasibility study. Consultations with stakeholders is really important for this process, but also throughout the impact assessment journey, as I mentioned. Consultations have to involve active engagements and not just rely on passive means like public announcements. A few years ago, upon the request of the World Heritage Committee, the State Party of Canada submitted a scoping study for an impact assessment concerning Wood Buffalo National Park. This site was inscribed under 3 criteria: but for the purpose of the illustration, I'll use criterion 7 as an example of how the state party went about using the statement of OUV in its scoping study. Criterion 7 can largely be split up into two sections shown in the red boxes. The first about the great concentrations of migratory wildlife of global importance, and second part about the rare and superlative natural phenomena. Let's take 1 and 2 as shown here. This is a small extracted section from the strategic environmental assessment, and I don't expect you to be able to see the detailed writing on this slide. So 1 and 2 from the previous slide are in the third column. It presents and splits the statement of OUV by attribute to make clear what the scope of the assessment is in terms of World Heritage. And as you can see, but not expecting you to read, it breaks down what these mean in terms of undertaking an impact assessment. Then moving on to the baseline assessment. In undertaking a baseline assessment, the statement of OUV is key in determining what data is needed. In the case of World Heritage, it will be directly linked to OUV and other heritage values. It is often necessary to carry out further analysis of heritage values and attributes that lie in the buffer zone and sometimes in the wider setting. This can involve collection of available information, or gaps may be identified, in which case new baseline studies should be carried out. One of the many important considerations for the baseline assessment is ensuring that there is an interdisciplinary team of experts. This paper, for example, makes reference to an EIA survey for a housing project in Panama's suburban forests, which reported only 12 common bird species in the project area. But when a bird expert then conducted a survey in the same area, in just 2 hours, identified 121 bird species, including several rare and threatened species. This difference in finding would clearly have a large implication on the project. So it's vital that you have the right team of expertise conducting the different elements of the impact assessment. At this stage, there should be clear understanding of the proposed project and the actions involved. This includes the boundaries and the extent of the project's impacts. Dams on rivers can alter water flow patterns, sedimentation, fish movement, as well as people's livelihoods, many kilometers away from the physical infrastructures. The impact assessment should therefore consider the entire lifetime of a proposed action, because potential impacts on OUV might occur at any stage. Impacts can take many forms and can be negative or positive, or direct or indirect. Direct impacts could include the physical construction of a hotel, leading to a loss of habitat where the infrastructure will be. Indirect impacts could include the subsequent increase in new tourism attractions as a result of increasing number of tourists. There is, of course, also cumulative impacts that result from more than one action and can be more significant than the impact of a single proposed action. For example, multiple hotels, which puts cumulative strain on water resources and water quality, transport, etc., and the combined loss or disruption to habitat. Once the potential impacts have been identified, they can be used to predict how the project will alter the baseline conditions compared to a scenario without the project, or if the project design or location is changed. For the evaluation of impacts, I'll use a case study from Denmark. The proposed project is the expansion of a port, which would extend the infrastructure to border the boundary of the World Heritage Site. The hashed green area is the very northern part of what is a very long World Heritage boundary. Yellow is the proposed yellow is another designation called the Natura 2000, so it's not part of the World Heritage Site. And the area shown in blue in both of these figures is the proposed project site. At the early conceptual stage, Denmark submitted an outline of the proposed project. This initial planning document presented the key information regarding the infrastructure and plans relating to the EIA. It outlined some key considerations that would be assessed in the EIA. This early planning and communication allowed us at IUCN and the World Heritage Centre to input at this very early stage what is required from the World Heritage perspective. So at the early conceptual stage, the State Party of Denmark shared this timeline with us spread over 2 years. In essence, what they did can be illustrated using this simplified diagram. So they announced the project, which is the very left box, then undertook around 8 months of consultations. The consultations were with the authorities at the different levels within Denmark, with neighboring countries as well, because this is a transboundary site, the members of the public, and also UNESCO and IUCN. We were therefore able to comment into the scoping study and raise any gaps or concerns at this early stage. After all the stakeholder consultation feedbacks were gathered, the EIA was prepared. Then another round of consultations were undertaken. Looking at the timeline, an additional 9 months was scheduled for this second round of consultations. Then they evaluated all feedbacks again before finalizing the EIA and making a decision on the project. So what is really important here to note is that a decision on the project wasn't made until the very end, until the end of this horizontal timeline, and construction or land preparation certainly hadn't begun. The EIA itself included photos and computer-generated image of the current view and future appearance from numerous locations and angles. This is one pair of photos where you can see the proposed infrastructures on the right-hand side of the image shown in the blue arrow. The site was inscribed on the World Heritage List for its coastal values. So one of its environmental factors it considered was sediment concentration. This figure taken from the EIA looks at pre-development, or basically current, sediment concentration during summer and winter, which would act as the baseline. And on the right-hand side, is some predicted changes using computer modeling, demonstrating the sediment concentration during the construction phase. There were also modeling results during the operational phase, which I haven't included here, but hopefully gives you an idea that the EIA comprehensively assessed various environmental factors, biotic and abiotic, including marine mammal mapping. The EIA systematically went through the 8 key principles outlined in the IUCN World Heritage Advice Note to clearly present how and why the EIA has complied with each of the 8 principles. With that, I can conclude my presentations for the steps 2 to 7, and I will pass over to my colleague, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morai. And with regard to the 5th and final presentation, we are again getting back to Mr. Richard Mackay, and then we will start the Q&A session. And I have to know that we have already received a lot of questions from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And yes, it's Richard Mackay here again. And one of my other roles is as the ICOMOS focal point for the World Heritage Leadership Program Heritage Impact Assessment Guidance. I won't repeat what Sarah and Mizuki have already said, other than to note that the ICOMOS and IUCN guidance still remain current, pending the promulgation of the new guidance on which we have been collaborating for some time now. And I'm going to overlap a little with Mizuki and deal with steps 4 to 11 in the process that she has outlined. Coming to step 4, which is understanding the outstanding universal value, I would simply highlight, and I will be using cultural examples in my presentation to match the natural examples in Mizuki's, that the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value from the World Heritage website, from the inscription, is a really useful place to start. And in the example on the screen of the Taj Mahal in India, if you go to the Documents tab in the World Heritage website and look at the words in the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, words like masterpiece of architectural style, or physical fabric in good condition, or functional and visual integrity, give you very good guidance as to attributes which need to be identified and which need to underpin the impact or the assessment of heritage impact. I'd highlighted, as I did in the other presentation, that this is not just about the criteria, but also about integrity and authenticity, and about protection and management. And I use a little example here from one of the Australian convict sites, part of the Australian Convict Sites World Heritage property. This is an archaeological site of a former prison, which was used in the last century. It's significant now as an archaeological site. And for this example, in understanding attributes, not only was the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value useful, but also citations that were drawn from both national and regional heritage inscriptions. I'm not expecting that you will read all the words on the screen, but I'm simply highlighting that in order to understand attributes that might be affected by a proposal, it's possible to break down the heritage listing citations from other jurisdictions, not just the World Heritage Convention. And in this case, by analysing the other citations, it was possible to conclude that a proposed development could have a physical impact on significant archaeological resources, including the physical remains associated with the history of the site. And I will come back to this example and explain how understanding that impact led to a change in the proposed development. The next step is, of course, to understand the proposal. And here what is important is getting sufficient documentation to understand the nature of the change that is intended. The example I'm showing you here will come up at the next session of the World Heritage Committee in around 2 weeks' time, and it is the maritime mercantile city of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. The intact historic waterfront is on the top left-hand of the screen. The development that's proposed is on the top right-hand corner of the screen, a very substantial change, including a large new football stadium shown in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And the point here is that the visualizations, as well as drawings and documents, enable an understanding of what the proposed action is. And this is really fundamental, and it is not always clear exactly what's proposed when an impact assessment process commences. It's then necessary, having understood the proposal, to identify the impacts. And here I come back to an example which Sarah Court showed, being the old town of Gaul and its fortifications in Sri Lanka. And in this case, in a chart with different columns, the Heritage Impact Assessment, which is available online, shows the attributes of the property that might be affected in the first column, the nature of the negative impact in the second column, and then uses the subsequent columns to assess that impact and to identify mitigation measures. So it's possible then to identify specific negative impacts and attach them to particular attributes of the property. I mentioned the colour coding, and the ICOMOS HIA guidance, the current one from 2011, is quite helpful in providing colour-coded charts which enable evaluation of the different types of impact and their severity. And if you look closely at the graphics on screen, you will note that even changes which are quite moderate can have a very large impact if they're undertaken in a World Heritage context. As was mentioned by Sarah, it's important, having understood the impacts, to look at mitigation and enhancement measures. And the triangular diagram on screen, which is reproduced from the International Association of Impact Assessment, shows a hierarchy where it's desirable overall to avoid, but if not, to minimise or rectify or reduce or offset. And I would make the comment here that for World Heritage, usually offsetting of impact is not possible because of the nature of the values. So what should be happening for World Heritage properties is that where negative impacts or impacts on outstanding universal value are identified, they should be avoided or minimised. Step 8 then involves re-evaluating. When there have been changes made to the project, it's important to evaluate the effect of those changes. So by altering a project to mitigate impacts or to enhance benefits, it's then important to re-understand the proposed action, to re-identify the potential impacts and to re-evaluate those impacts. So there is an iterative process built in. I make the point here that sometimes this impact assessment methodology can be iterative and needs to be repeated. And a good example of that is the case study on screen, the iconic World Heritage property of Stonehenge, also in the United Kingdom, where multiple phases of heritage impact assessment were undertaken in order to evaluate the differential impact of different schemes. Now, this process is not yet satisfactorily resolved. There's some very difficult management challenges related to the construction of a major road. But the point here is that with different options, it was possible to undertake a separate impact assessment, allowing informed decisions about the effect on World Heritage values. Step 9 involves reporting. And what is important here is that there is clarity in the reporting. Again, I share an example which Sarah has already shown you, the Villa Adriana example from Italy, where the issue was the development in the vicinity. And the clarity in reporting here shows where the property is, where the proposed development is, and articulated very, very clearly what the nature of the impact was. And very importantly, and often left out for World Heritage properties, this heritage impact assessment included that vital step of assessing whether the project should even proceed, or whether in fact a wiser recommendation would be that the project not continue. It's also very helpful to re-evaluate where there have been these mitigative changes made. And I come back to the example of the archaeological site that I showed earlier, where the proposed development was a new visitor history and interpretation centre. And as a result of the identification of an adverse impact, the design of the building was changed to avoid the disturbance of the archaeological zones. And what had been an unacceptable adverse impact, by virtue of the change of design, becomes a neutral impact. It's coloured blue on the screen in front of you. And what was an unacceptable proposal becomes an acceptable proposal, which can be supported by the Heritage Impact Assessment document. The final step, of course, is the decision making. And the reason that this Heritage Impact Assessment process is undertaken for World Heritage properties is to allow well-informed decisions. And I fittingly conclude with the Villa Adriana example from Italy, where the HIA Heritage Impact Assessment determined that the development project for the Comprensorio de Ponte Luciano would have a large negative impact on the heritage attributes within the World Heritage property and on its relation to the landscape which surrounds it, the buffer zone, which convey outstanding universal value and other cultural values, some of which constitute potential outstanding universal value. And this report very properly and bravely concluded that the only option available to the state party that would totally avoid this situation would be to halt the development project. So I'm very happy to end at that point and would be pleased to participate in answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our distinguished speakers today. I suggest that without any delay, we immediately get down to questions to our Q&A session. Question 1 was addressed in Kazakh, and it was asked at the very beginning of our webinar. Let me try to read it, and let me try to respond to it as one of the co-organizers. Our experts can actually comment on my answer if they have anything to complement. So the question sounded like this. While the list of the World Heritage Sites of UNESCO includes some of the sites that reminds of the tragical, bloody pages in history of humankind? Can you classify them in any specific group? I'd like to say that UNESCO in general and the World Heritage Center and the consultative bodies, they divide facilities both in the World Heritage List and the preliminary list of the heritage lists only for cultural, mixed, or landscape value. So basically, they should comply with the outstanding universal value and integrity of the facility. That's what but this kind of formulation is to be submitted by the state itself. Some of the facilities can be included into the list of heritage under the threat, exposed to some threat. But some questions like memorial assessment, or basically the interpretation, what needs to be done with the memory of people who tragically died or have been buried on these sites. We're not really doing this. This is strictly up to the local communities and local governments. UNESCO doesn't really classify them in any particular category. I'm not sure whether our speakers would like to add anything, or would you like me to go to the next question right away? So I assume we can move to the next question. There will be a few. And basically, they all relate to the topic of the buffer zones. Well, basically, in a way, they complement each other, contextualize each other. So I just would like to read them all together. And then our distinguished experts can try to provide us with some answer. First of all, Ms. Bakhenta Sabayeva is asking this. What's the precise definition of the memorial buffer zone? What's the precise definition? Then Galia Limzhanova is asking Mr. Boris Urk, and she's asking this. Is this possible to do the adjustment of the borders of the nominated facility, the UNESCO nomination, in line with the laws and regulations of the Republic of Kazakhstan? What's the specific algorithm of action that needs to be employed? If I understand the question correctly, what's the procedure, what's the mechanism to change the actual borders of the sites, site border change request? And the third question, well, the second question should probably be addressed to the specialists on cultural heritage, because it relates to the Tamgali heritage site. The question sounds like this. The area of the National Park of Tamgali covers 3,800 hectares. The buffer zone out of this, 2,900 hectares, or 3/4. And the specially protected area itself is only 900 hectares. So in this connection, a question. Is this possible to install the fences and only guard the area that actually needs to be protected? And the second question that also relates to Tamgali, and Mr. Boris Zheleznikov continues with the same question on the same key. He says that the buffer zone of Tamgali is 2,900 hectares. Basically, this is the main territory of the national park and covers the monuments from all sides. And the Talgar ancient town site, well, basically, this is one of the Silkway heritage sites. The area of the facility is fenced and is actually physically guarded. Its buffer zone is somewhat amorphous and is sometimes used for the needs of the modern town nearby, the impact of which on this facility hasn't yet been identified. Please specify the norms or requirements for the buffer zones for the mixed or cultural heritage sites. Is this possible to adjust the area of these buffer zones depending on the city's development priorities? And the last question about the buffer zones, well, this is from Lizat Bisimbaeva. The question is to ICOMOS cultural heritage. Is this possible to resize the buffer zone borders of the archaeological facility? Should it be recommended by the experts from ICOMOS when doing the reactive monitoring of the site? We're talking about the excluding from the nomination territory any the existing area of the rural graveyard. This is the actively used rural graveyard. The active buffer zone, there is no notion or definition of that in the laws and regulations of the countries of Central Asia. So every country has its own division. So these issues are often relevant and the questions are being asked. Mr. Richard Mackay would like to respond to some of the questions. I suggest we give him the floor first. Mr. Mackay.
Thank you, colleagues. To answer the first question up front, the buffer zone is broadly an area that is larger than the inscribed property, and it is an area in which there are attributes which need to be protected and managed in order to conserve and protect the outstanding universal values of the property. So if you like, it's an area usually bigger than the property, which also needs management in order to conserve World Heritage values. The boundary of the inscribed property and the boundary of the buffer zone can both be adjusted after inscription. Sometimes that will be instigated by the state party. Sometimes it will be instigated as a result of the reactive monitoring process from a mission or something similar and a committee resolution. There are two ways in which the boundaries of the inscribed property or the buffer zone can be changed. If it is a small change and it doesn't affect the statement of outstanding universal value for the property, then that can be done by a simple resolution of the committee based on a dossier that's supplied by the state party, subject to advice from the advisory bodies. If it is a major boundary change, or it is a change that affects the statement of outstanding universal value, the state party does need to make a renomination. In other words, it needs to put forward a whole new nomination which explains why there is such a major change. I'm not able to comment on the specifics of Tangali. Others may be in a position to do that, but I would comment that under the operational guidelines to the World Heritage Convention, the national governments, which are the state party, have an obligation to put in place suitable statutory arrangements to manage not only the inscribed property, but also the buffer zone. So insofar as there are not adequate statutory arrangements in place, that is something that should be done and is indeed required by the World Heritage Convention obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mackay. The next one was Mr. Boris Eric. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think that Richard properly answered the question of a buffer zones. Even so, it's a large subject, and of course that the operational guidelines define it in detail. It's important to mention that while they do not constitute a World Heritage property, they are being evaluated and assessed and then looked into throughout the monitoring process later on. So they have to be properly designed and they have to be properly managed. Even better, so if there are legal requirements and there are legal mechanisms for that, you know. So it really has to be looked into as per the specific question. In terms of boundaries as well, whether it's minor or significant, what matters here is the state party informs the World Heritage Committee as soon as possible, as soon as there is an intent or a necessity, whatever, to change or modify the boundaries of the World Heritage property. So the sooner the World Heritage Committee and advisory bodies are informed, the better. Yeah. But also I see this question on adding a natural criteria to an inscribed World Heritage site. Since in this particular case, adding criterion 10 to the already inscribed criterion 3 would actually mean that site would become a mixed site instead of a cultural site that is already. That is possible. So to answer the question, yes, that is certainly possible. But both mixed or just a cultural natural World Heritage sites, they have one statement of outstanding universal value. So it has to be looked into how that, whether the statement of OUV has to be changed or not. But since it will actually add a natural criterion to the cultural World Heritage site, that would actually trigger a new nomination. So yes, that technically is possible. We have cases when a cultural natural sites have become a mixed sites, But of course, that's a whole lot new nomination that will be then will have to be evaluated by the World Heritage Center and the advisory bodies.
Большое спасибо, господин Эрк.
Thank you very much, Mr. Erk. Mr. Erk has been even able to cover the next question, which I was going to ask you later by the user Janar. Let me read the question aloud so that anyone listens to the recording of this, they will not be able to read. They would not be able to read the chat box. So Tamgali is a modern name of the facility that had been classified as Tamgali previously. So Tambali is basically was included into the World Heritage under criteria 3, but apart from the monuments, it's got rich flora and fauna. So the question was, is it possible to include reclassify or renominate this facility as a mixed site and use this not just a cultural heritage, but mixed heritage, cultural and natural heritage? So I mark this question as answered, and I'd like to pass the floor to Ms. Sarah Court, who also raised her hand, and we'll move to the other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick addition. Whilst we recognise the importance of the boundaries and the buffer zone, they need to be defined and they need to be well managed. We are finding that impact assessment, the need for it has come because there's a lot of factors that can affect World Heritage that are outside of the property and outside the buffer zone. So I just think it's worth remembering that a good buffer zone is fantastic, but it doesn't always solve our problems, and that tools such as impact assessment and others can really help us understand when there are factors outside the property that need to be addressed as well. And we're not just always focusing within our boundaries for management. Thank you.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, now we're moving on to the next question, which is addressed to Mr. Richard Mackay again, and the question is asked by Lizat Bisimbaeva. She is asking about one of the examples that you quoted in your first PowerPoint, the amusement center in the historical amusement, the Luna Park in the city of Sydney. Are you planning to update the mechanisms of this entertainment facilities, amusement park, and how will affect the universal outstanding value of these facilities?
Thank you for that question. The short answer is that yes, as we are here tonight, work is nearly complete on a phase of upgrading of the amusements because they have to comply with contemporary requirements for health and safe operations. And in fact, very little of the physical fabric of the place that you see today, in fact, nothing that you can see was there when the site was first built, because the very nature of the fabric is that it is ephemeral and it requires constant replacement. And this is why I used it as an example of very customized management planning, because in this cultural property, the values are attached to its concept and its idea and its Art Deco design and the contemporary use of amusement rides. And so it's all of those things that are conserved and maintained, not the fabric. So yes, there are new rides. And when you come to Australia, please come and visit because it's a lot of fun.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mackay. The next question is from Galia Alimjanova. The question sounds like this. I just would like to know whether there are any positive examples of experience from the other countries where they have farming or some other economic activities in the areas that are very close or almost adjacent to the World Heritage sites. Are there any examples when this activity develops well without actual damaging World Heritage sites? The question is not addressed to anyone in particular. Please, any takers? Mr. Mackay, please, you're welcome.
Yes, and this all depends, of course, on the reasons for the inscription of the World Heritage property. Farming is quite common in cultural World Heritage properties. So Bagan in Myanmar is a sacred landscape where the setting of the temples is surrounded by farmed agricultural land. The example that I showed in my first presentation of Angkor in Cambodia, there are 100,000 people who live within the Angkor Park, and they all farm their domestic properties. There are actually agricultural landscapes that are inscribed because of the agriculture. The rice terraces in the Philippines and in Bali in Indonesia are examples of that. And there are, of course, other productive landscapes such as the Prosecco country in Italy or the Champagne country in France that are actually inscribed because of the farming activities that take place. This all depends on the nature of the value. I imagine it would be almost unheard of in a property that was inscribed for natural reasons, but I would defer to my colleague Mizuki about that.
Distinguished experts, would anyone else like to comment on this question, or would you like me to move to the next one, please? I assume I can proceed to the next question. This is from an anonymous user, and this is about the cultural heritage facility, mausoleum of Muhammad Haja Yasawi in the town of Turkestan in the south of Kazakhstan, the first facility that was inscribed by Kazakhstan. This is about the impact assessment on the monument in Kazakhstan. Did they do any impact assessment from the standpoint of the construction of the new facilities in this town area? If you don't know the context, the town of Turkestan that recently was classified as a provincial center, it became a local province center and it started the huge scale construction. And all of the inscribed facilities are located inside these very same areas. And around them, there is a massive construction effort is underway. So the question is, did they do any impact assessment there? Okay, then, since our experts aren't really willing to speak about this facility, probably they don't know the details. Well, let me put this link into the chat. This is the link to the World Heritage Center. That's where you can find some information about all of these facilities, including this mausoleum, the country reports they submitted or they submit on a regular basis, and the report that they had submitted previously in case of Turkestan, they had submitted this in the light of the new construction effort because of the change of the whole town landscape. Now you can see this link in the chat box, and also in the past few years they've been doing some missions by the consultative bodies there based on the World Heritage Convention. So basically, clearly this question has been subject to some discussion, and people from the World Heritage Center, they did issue some opinions, or they had at least been notified about the course of this construction. Okay, let me move to the next question. This is from Mr. Boris Zheleznikov. Who is supposed to organize and finance the compilation of the management plan for the World Heritage Sites and the impact assessment? Who would like to take this question? I see Ms. Mizuki is willing to take this one. Please, over to you.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the question. With regard to the management plan, as well as being a World Heritage Site, the area that is inscribed as a World Heritage Site usually has a national designation. So if I refer to, for example, the natural World Heritage Sites, it will normally be a national park or maybe a game reserve, in which case it will naturally have a management plan, and it will have under the national legislation a requirement to have a such management plan. So I mean, it's possible that the World Heritage component is added within the existing sort of framework of the management plan, and to make sure that the World Heritage criteria, the specific World Heritage criteria, are included within that sort of larger framework for the management plan. So, I mean, in terms of who finances it, is dependent on the country, probably dependent on the individual sort of province, at the more local level as to how that is done. And as for the impact assessment, generally speaking, if it is a project-based environmental impact assessment, it is the project proponent that that undertakes the impact assessment. A strategic environmental assessment, which we haven't talked about specifically in this webinar, is at the much sort of larger scale and is usually government funded. But again, these are all sort of dependent on a case-by-case basis. Going back to the management plan, the UNESCO does have an international assistance sort of fund framework, and states parties are able to request funding if, for example, financial assistance is required for the continued protection of World Heritage Sites. So this could, in theory, include management planning.
Thank you very much. And I see that Mr. Mackay also raised the hand, and then please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would just comment quickly that one of the pillars of outstanding universal value is protection and management. And it is usual for the state party to set out the management arrangements as part of a nomination. And so it is also usual for the management authority within the state party, whoever is responsible, if it's a historic site, the owner of that historic site or the manager of that historic site. If it's a government-owned archaeological site, then the government agency which owns the site. If it's a private building, then the private owner of that site, they would normally fund the management plan. In terms of heritage impact assessment, it is always the responsibility of the proponent of the development or the change who should be responsible for that, because HIA is a normal part of planning any change or development at a World Heritage property. Thank you.
Mr. Erk, you also raised your hand. Would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, спасибо. Just to build on this question on management planning and what my colleague Mizuki mentioned, we had this an interesting discussion last week at the regional committee for Western Chechen meeting, where this the issue of management planning was raised. I says this is a transnational serial site, as Mizuki said, that sites are by default they designated at national level, and they should have some management process or management plan. That then those management plans for component sites, they should integrate the statement of outstanding universal value. So they should be either developed or reviewed in light of the OUV. Whereas for the transnational site, you know, can we build one management framework or one management plan? There will be another layer ensuring that the transnational site is property is properly managed. So that's the way of either developing new management plans or integrating OUV in existing management planning processes as per national law.
Thank you. I believe that we have already ran out of time. Therefore, I will probably read out the last question to our experts, and then we will wind up our webinar. The question was both in Russian and in English. I'm going to send it in English, and I will read it out in Russian. And the question is coming from Yevgen Tikenov. The question is as follows: what are the consequences of the lack of capacity buildings and insufficient financial support provided by the government, and limitation the interested parties' involvement into the project. What can the international bodies do with the national authorities if the national authorities are not taking into consideration sustainable development goals with regard to the World Heritage Sites? Is anybody volunteering to answer this question? What can be stated here? UNESCO in general and the World Heritage Committee and the advisory bodies are not aiming at either praising or complaining about the countries and the way they are managing their sites. The countries will have to take the decisions how to nominate their properties and how to manage them, whereas the international experts and international organizations are here to help the countries to do it in accordance and in full compliance with the World Heritage criteria, in accordance with the World Heritage Convention and in accordance with the operational guidelines which are proposed by the World Heritage Committee. Therefore, what can the international bodies do? They can only provide their advice and provide their support in case if the government would like to do something with these sites, either to nominate them or to introduce some specific management modes. I believe that this will probably sum up the stance of everybody present here. And in conclusion, I would like to say that it was really a great pleasure for us to hear our experts today who, in a very understandable language, were explaining the details of managing World Heritage properties. And I would like to remind you that on the 8th of July, we will have the follow-up seminar. And now in the chat, you will find the links for registration for this webinar and the materials that are available. The recording of this particular webinar is going to be published in YouTube, both in English and in Russian. Very shortly, the presentations of the speakers, both in Russian and in English, will be sent by email to the registered participants of our today's webinar. The email address that you provided us with during the registration, you will receive all the materials at these email addresses. Thank you very much to all our participants, to our audience and our speakers, and our lecturers. Thank you very much indeed, and see you again this Thursday.